They told me it was just a joke the night my own family stood around the table and laughed at me, laughed so hard they didn't notice I'd stopped breathing. It wasn't the words that broke me. It was the way their eyes slid past me, the way no one reached out, the way I realized quietly, painfully, that I could disappear right there and not a single person would stand up for me. That was the night something inside me cracked for good. And that was the night I learned the truth about myself. And about them. My name is Claire. I drove from Detroit toward Toledo under a strangely cold May sky. The kind of chill that settles into your sleeves and reminds you you're heading somewhere you once tried to leave behind. The town looked exactly as it had the day I walked away. As if nothing here had moved an inch while my life had splintered and reshaped itself miles away. My aunt had spent the entire week insisting my father wanted me at the company's 50th anniversary celebration. I doubted he'd said any such thing, but agreeing was easier than fighting her hope that this trip might stitch something back together. When I reached the house, my father opened the door for barely a breath before turning away, telling me to make myself comfortable. His tone carried that familiar distance, the kind that makes you feel like a guest in the place that raised you. A message from Lorraine buzzed against my palm. Make sure you wear something appropriate. It's a big night. The meaning underneath was clearer than the words. Don't draw attention. Walking through the living room. I froze at a framed photograph my father standing beside several military officers. At the far right was Brigadier General Robert Keaton. The sight hit me hard. A silent punch to the ribs. He was the last person who saw me step out of the life I once lived. Unaware that everything about me would soon vanish from public record. That night, lying awake in the guest room, I felt the weight of what tomorrow might stir up. Coming back hadn't been part of any plan, and now the past was already pressing against the door. Just before turning off my phone, I noticed a new email, no title, no words, only a sender's name, R. Keaton at Meal. I didn't open it. I simply turned off the light and stayed sitting in the dark, my pulse refusing to settle. The next morning, I arrived at the event hall where the celebration would be held. Lorraine was already stationed in the center of the room, directing the crew with the confidence of someone performing for an audience. Every so often she shot a quick glance my way, the kind that skimmed over a person to make sure they weren't stepping out of line. I understood my role long before she said anything. Stay small, stay muted, stay out of photographs. The seating chart hung near the entrance. My name sat neatly beside a tiny dot indicating the table near the service aisle. The overflow section. The place for people who were meant to be present but not seen. I didn't feel surprise, only the familiar weight of resignation settling between my ribs. As I walked toward the table, a young security guard passed by. His eyes dropped to my wrist, and his face changed instantly. The faint, circular indentation on my skin, the kind left behind by a certain type of identification band, caught his attention. For a fraction of a second, he froze, as if he'd stumbled onto something he wished he hadn't recognized. Then he pivoted sharply and hurried in the opposite direction, his shoulders stiff with tension. I sat down to test the chair, and a server brushing past knocked into it hard enough to jostle me forward. A moment later, another did the same. The message didn't need words. This wasn't a place of honor. This was the table for people who didn't matter. Lorraine finally swept over, her smile polished but hollow at the center. She placed a hand on the back of the chair as if stabilizing it and me along with it. Just sit where you're assigned and smile when appropriate. That's all you need to do. I matched her smile with one of my own, though mine didn't ring nearly as empty. Her confidence clattered like cold metal. Impressive from afar, but impossible to hold without cutting yourself. Across the room, an older man in a tailored suit watched me with an intensity that made the air shift. Not curiosity recognition, the kind that stirs something deep in your chest. But the second Lorraine introduced me to a nearby guest as the sister who worked in Detroit. The man straightened his spine and turned away sharply, as if he'd just seen a line he wasn't allowed to cross. I knew that look. It belonged to someone who recognized a truth they had been instructed to ignore. I wandered through the hall, pretending to admire floral arrangements, though really I was searching for a corner untouched by noise at the far wall. My father had arranged a display of photographs, decades of partnerships, donors, community leaders, a curated catalog of everyone he believed mattered. And then, in the third row, I saw him, Brigadier General Robert Keaton. The breath caught in my throat. The image showed him younger, sharper around the edges, the same man who had once commanded a unit that operated in shadows most people would never know existed. The man who had seen me at my highest, and at the moment I walked away. The sight of him sliced through memory like a sudden blade. For a moment I couldn't move. Lorraine appeared behind me, her heels tapping briskly against the polished floor. She glanced at the photo, then at me. "People like this have nothing to do with your life," she said it lightly, but the words hit with surgical precision. If she had known which scar she was touching, she might have stopped herself. Or maybe she wouldn't have. Sometimes cruelty doesn't require intention, just habit. I stepped away from the wall, trying to steady the rhythm of my breathing. As I turned the corner, the same young security guard from earlier approached. He said nothing, only dipped his head in a gesture so small most people would have missed it. But I'd seen that gesture before. It wasn't civilian politeness. It was the instinctive acknowledgement of someone accustomed to standing before a superior. Before I could react, another guard, older, higher-ranking, strode over and tugged him back by the elbow. He whispered something low and tense, and the younger guard immediately retreated. Keeping his distance, as if proximity to me posed a risk neither of them was permitted to take. They weren't avoiding me because I didn't matter. They were avoiding me because, to someone, I mattered far too much. I walked away from the display, the faint hum of the room fading behind me. A tight, familiar ache curled beneath my ribs. An ache I hadn't felt since the heat of a distant desert, and the weight of a past life I'd sworn I'd buried for good. When the ceremony began, I took the seat placed for me beside the service station, far from the center tables where the family gathered. The warm lights, the polished silverware, the chatter, it all felt strangely distant, as if I were watching from behind a barrier I could never cross again. Lorraine stepped onto the stage with the confidence of someone who believed the whole evening belonged to her. She dove straight into a story about how I'd once left home chasing some dream she claimed fell apart. The crowd laughed easily. I stayed still. My father stood behind her, smiling just enough to appear supportive, but not enough to defend me. A relative nearby added a comment about me never settling, and the old sting bloomed again in the space between my ribs. I set my glass down carefully to keep my hand from trembling. Then something in the room shifted. At the back of the hall, a small formation of uniformed soldiers entered with deliberate, practiced steps. Their eyes scanned the crowd not casually, but with silent evaluation. Lorraine kept talking, her voice rising with each laugh. But the presence of those men carved an invisible line through the room. When I bent to pick up a fallen napkin, I saw 3 pairs of polished military shoes at the entrance. The soldier at the front looked in my direction and straightened sharply. A reflex he couldn't hide. No one else noticed. They kept laughing on one side while something far colder settled on the other. I pushed back my chair, needing air. One of the soldiers broke from the group and followed, his footsteps too familiar to ignore. The side hallway was dimmer, quieter, and for a moment I let myself breathe. But the steady rhythm of boots approached from behind, quick, precise, unbroken. The entire unit was moving toward me. The lead soldier caught sight of my wrist where my sleeve had shifted, revealing the faint indentation I'd spent years hiding. He stopped instantly. Recognition spread across his face before he masked it, but his posture changed completely, tightening into formal respect. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. A firm voice cut through the hallway. "Hold position!" The silver insignias on their shoulders glinted under the lights. These weren't ceremonial guards. They were men from a unit I knew better than I wished to remember. The younger one twitched as if to salute, but another soldier gripped his arm to stop him. They weren't allowed to acknowledge me here, not in public, yet their faces betrayed everything. I turned slightly, intending to escape the moment, but a slower, heavier step echoed from the far end of the hall. I didn't need to see him to know who it was. Brigadier General Robert Keaton emerged from the shadows, his gaze steady and unreadable. Lorraine's voice burst behind me, sharp and annoyed, unaware of the man standing just feet away. Before she could reach me, one of the soldiers said quietly, with absolute clarity, "General, target confirmed." My pulse stumbled. The word target carried two meanings, both of them unmistakably mine. In that breath of silence, the life my family thought I lived, and the life they never knew, collided head-on. I stood at the end of the hallway, the echo of military boots tightening behind me as the distant music from the main hall thinned out. Lorraine brushed past with a look of annoyance, tapping my shoulder and asking why I had wandered off when people were apparently looking for me. She had no idea the air behind us carried the weight of something about to detonate. Then Brigadier General Keaton stepped out of the golden light. His presence pulled the entire corridor into silence. Lorraine glanced between us, confused, then let out a short, incredulous laugh, assuming I was embarrassing myself by pretending to know him. She didn't notice the soldier behind him suddenly straightening, hands clasped behind his back in perfect readiness. That stance alone forced my breath to falter. Men didn't do that unless they were in the presence of someone outranking even their own commanding officer. Lorraine kept smiling, telling me not to create a scene at our father's event. Before I could answer, the Brigadier General stopped in front of me. I watched Lorraine's expression shift. The moment she sensed something was off, but couldn't place it. Then, with deliberate precision, he set his right foot half a step back, lifted his chin, and stood at full attention before me. The air collapsed until it held only him, his soldiers, Lorraine, and the shadow of who I used to be. I heard Lorraine swallow hard. When he spoke my title, his voice low and resonant, the hallway snapped into a new shape. The soldiers behind him snapped to full attention. This was not a gesture for show. It was recognition. The doors to the hall opened as guests stepped out for air. They froze at the sight of a brigadier general standing at rigid attention before me. The noise inside faded as faces turned and stared. Lorraine gripped my sleeve, trembling, whispering for an explanation I couldn't yet give. The truth was arriving faster than I could hold it back. The doors widened, and when the brigadier general and I stepped inside, the room fell into an unnatural stillness. Even the soft clinking of glasses died off, every eye fixed on us as if the air itself had shifted direction. Lorraine's voice cracked beside me, demanding to know who he was. But the brigadier general moved ahead. He raised his hand in a flawless salute and addressed me with a clarity that sliced through the room. "Ma'am, welcome back." The effect was immediate. Conversation stopped mid-breath. My father, standing near the wall of framed achievements, stared at me like he'd been struck. A young soldier left the formation and stood before me, saying he remembered my directive in Fallujah, the order that saved his life. The hall trembled with shock. Lorraine fell back into a chair, staring at me as if she'd never seen me before. The brigadier general addressed the crowd, revealing that I had once coordinated operations for a classified federal unit. The people who had laughed minutes earlier were silent now, standing, adjusting their posture, seeing me in an entirely different light. My father stepped toward me, uncertain where to stand. I held his gaze without speaking. Years of silence lived there. Then the brigadier general leaned closer and said there was a letter meant for me that had never been delivered, and that it was finally time to open it. Brigadier General Keaton's words had barely settled when the hall shifted into a silence so dense it felt like the air had weight. I stood under the white lights at the center of the room, more exposed than ever, yet steadier than I expected. Every face that had laughed minutes earlier now looked carved from stone. The general straightened, his voice turning official. He told them I had once coordinated federal combat operations in the Middle East, that my records were sealed for protection. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. Lorraine collapsed into a chair, her face drained. My father gripped the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping him upright. A gray-haired soldier stepped forward, standing at attention. "Ma'am, I was the Bravo team leader. I'm alive because of your withdrawal order." Gas erupted. Eyes widened. The world I'd hidden pressed into the open. Then the older man who had studied me earlier stepped out, removing his glasses with shaking hands. "I served under Keaton. I know who the shadow controller was. It was you, wasn't it? The name hit like a detonated memory. Lorraine's voice broke as she asked why I'd never told her. Some things, I said quietly, stop belonging to you once you speak them. The general moved beside my father, lowering his voice. It's time she receives what was always meant for her, and I knew he meant the letter, the one my father kept for 15 years. Brigadier General Keaton asked for a private room, and my father walked ahead of us with a slight bend in his back, a posture I had never witnessed in the man who'd always stood like steel. When the door closed, the general reached into his breast pocket and pulled out an old envelope. Its edges yellowed with age. My name was written on the front in a firm, familiar hand. "This is from Colonel Hayes," he said. "He wrote it for your family after the final operation." I looked at my father. He couldn't meet my eyes. I took the envelope. The seal had been broken once, then pressed back into place. My breath caught. My fingers trembled. "You opened it," I said. His eyes shut, his shoulders folding inward. The general stood at attention, witnessing a truth heavier than any classified report. My father's voice came rough and strained. I didn't know how to face it. "Claire, you were changing. You were going somewhere I couldn't follow. I didn't want to lose you." The anger I expected never came. Instead, a quieter realization settled over me. He hadn't hidden the letter out of resentment. He'd hidden it because my becoming someone beyond his control frightened him. The general interrupted, his tone sharp. "Mr. Young, she saved more than 20 lives. She fought while her family believed she wasn't capable. She deserved to be known long before this." My father's face crumpled, and tears fell, the first I had ever seen from him. I unfolded the letter, ink heavy on the page. Colonel Hayes described how a single decision I made in the final minutes had saved his entire unit. He called me the soul of the operation. I folded it back carefully. No tears came, only a quiet depth inside me, steady and still. I told my father softly, "I don't need you to be proud. I just need you not to bury me while I'm still alive." He sank into a chair, covering his face with both hands. The general stepped forward and touched my shoulder. "Ma'am, you don't have to hide who you are anymore." In that moment, I understood that everything was about to end, just not in any way I had ever imagined. I stepped out of the private room into a quiet that seemed to stretch across the entire hall. Conversations had resumed in small clusters, but when I appeared, people shifted aside instinctively, as if unsure how to move around me now that the truth had rearranged everything they thought they knew. A few even stood as I passed, not out of protocol, but because they genuinely didn't know what else to do. Lorraine waited near the doorway, her eyes still red. She looked smaller somehow, like the weight of the night had settled onto her shoulders. She asked if I was coming back to the house, her voice fragile with something that wasn't quite regret, but wasn't defiance anymore, either. I shook my head. There was no anger in the gesture, no lingering sting, only the quiet understanding that some chapters aren't meant to be reopened once they've closed. A few steps behind her, my father hovered at a distance. He looked like he wanted to reach for me, but didn't know if he had the right anymore. He called my name soft, unsteady, as though the air itself might swallow the apology he couldn't finish. I didn't turn back, not out of cruelty, but because I had finally learned that not all wounds require a confrontation to heal. I made my way toward the parking lot, the muffled hum of the event fading behind me. The cold air met me first, a clean, bracing contrast to everything heavy indoors. I was almost at my car when footsteps matched my pace. Brigadier General Keaton didn't speak until I opened the door. "We never forgot you," he said. The simplicity of it cut deeper than any ceremony, any salute, any revelation. I looked at him for a long moment, not as a superior, not as a figure from a life stamped classified, but as the only person tonight who spoke to the version of me that had survived everything quietly. It wasn't nostalgia that stirred in me, and it wasn't pride. It was clarity, the sharp, grounding sense of finally seeing myself without distortion. I placed the letter on the passenger seat, started the engine, and eased out of the lot, not fleeing, not abandoning, but moving forward with the name I had carried in silence for years. The version of myself they had never known. I didn't need anyone's approval. I didn't need anyone's understanding. I didn't even need forgiveness. Ma'am, welcome back. His voice echoed inside me, not as a summons to return to the military, but as a return to myself, the truest one I had ever been.